Hi, this is Marshall Toplansky.
And Joel Kotkin.
And welcome to the Feudal Future podcast. If you're listening, it means you're interested in creating a better future, one that values diverse discussion and preserves opportunity for the middle and working classes.
This is why we started the show, to bring together ideas and people that challenge the notion of a hierarchical, socially stagnant, and centrally programmed future. Maybe you've experienced the rising costs of home ownership, diminishing job prospects, or the burden of over-regulation and increasingly censorship. This is happening in cities everywhere, and we recognize the need for new action.
For this reason, we created the Beyond Feudalism Facebook group, a place for you to connect and share resources with like-minded people. Here you'll be able to ask questions, network, and share your own stories and ideas on how we can bring opportunity and common sense back into our civil discourse and governance.
Consider this a hub for all things feudal, where we'll be sharing insights from our recent Beyond Feudalism report with Chapman University, clips and highlights from the podcast, and links to related content on topics such as housing, education, energy, transportation, and entrepreneurship. Much of our focus has been so far on California, but we expect to see this work and apply this work to conditions around the world.
Well, as you can probably tell, we're not too excited about the path we're currently on as a society, but we are hopeful for what's possible. And if we can better understand what's happening and build momentum to overcome the trends, so much the better.
So we encourage you to join the Facebook group via the link below to get involved and keep up-to-date information on all new developments. And for more information, my new book, The Coming of Neo-feudalism, outlines everything that's happening and where we need to change. The link to that is also in the show description.
So thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
But if you're going to have growth, if you're going to be what California, I think, was, or what you guys and I appreciate about it, this dynamic, inviting, exciting, vibrant, growing, young state, and not just old farts like us, then I think you got to have some vision of housing growth.
This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast with Joel Kotkin and I. And today we are delighted to welcome Mike Shellenberger. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Glad you could make it. Mike is the author of the best-selling book that has just come out called Apocalypse Never.
Why environmental alarmism hurts us all.
Well, and you know, it's actually, it syncs so well with what Joel and I have been talking about in terms of the emergence of feudalism in California, because the cost of the environmental regulations that have been promulgated in California is so high that it drives the cost up on everything. And the trade-offs, no one's making any trade-offs between prosperity and protecting the economy because they're so alarmed by the Greta Gundersons of the world who say that the planet's going to end in 5 seconds.
It's Greta Thunberg.
Oh, I keep calling her Gunderson.
No, Marshall, the stuff that you get wrong is so funny. Don't stop, dude.
Okay, I know. Well, there's a certain
just
comedic
keep getting it wrong, man. It's fine.
Right.
Yeah, it's much more interesting.
I bet she wishes she were named Greta Gunderson. I mean,
Gunderson's better.
So, the constant, in your face, the world is going to end in 5 minutes. It does not create an environment that's conducive for rational decision making. How are we going to fix this problem, Mike?
Well, first, thanks, guys, for having me on. I'm, excited to be here. As you know, I'm a huge fan of Joel's work on cities and suburbs and why they're important, and the ways that you guys are pushing back against the kind of dogma here. And I think that the question of feudalism, neo-feudalism, this incredibly stratified and increasingly stratified society of, affluent knowledge workers that own all the property and a lot of underpaid service workers is kind of the big issue, right? And what do you do about that? In fact, it's such a big issue that I'm happy to say that my next book is going to be about San Francisco, ostensibly about the homeless crisis, which is a word we will attack and reject and basically show how it's propaganda. But nonetheless, I think that what you guys are working on and looking at is the most important questions. I'm not sure that we agree on everything. Joel knows that I speak my mind on all sorts of questions. I think I favor density more than you guys. But nonetheless, I'm just really happy to sit down and have a conversation with you. And we can talk about Apocalypse Never, or we can talk about California too. California is definitely on my mind. I've been reading a lot about it. I've got the chapters already. I already know what the chapter titles are and what the next book argument is. So thanks for having me.
Well, no, we're delighted to have you. But obviously the connection between the forces at work in California that are prioritizing environmental protection at all costs is getting in the way of balanced development and balanced prosperity in the state. So how do you tackle this kind of emotionally based problem so that you can get to a place where rational decision making is happening?
Yeah, it seems like the first thing is that we have to actually get clear about what our values are and sort of what our vision is, because it seems like we may just all have different visions of what we want out of California. And if we can acknowledge that, certainly different interests, right? So, people working at tech companies are going to have different interests than you guys, and maybe than me, or maybe not. And it doesn't seem like people are honest about that we just hide everything behind a kind of moralizing discourse. As opposed to with cities in particular, it's just kind of like, what kind of city do you want? Like, it's just completely, you can have very different kinds of cities on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems like the stuff that I've seen on the cities, was it MIT who did those big studies of how cities develop? Is that right, Joel? And I remember looking at it and then finding that you always have densification happening with extensification.
Oh, yeah, no, that's NYU, Solly Angel. Yeah.
I thought that pattern was super interesting. That flows right out of Apocalypse Never, which is a story of rising power densities with economic development as you get to different modes of production. So you go from, we call it the wood fuel organic economy of small shareholder agriculture, which is 2 billion people are still stuck in that, to, capitalist industrialization, which requires fossil fuels. And then my view is you keep going up the energy ladder to nuclear. That's what California in the 50s and 60s wanted to do. That's what liberals in California wanted to do. That's what they were doing. That was the progressive thing, was nuclear. And then we had this new left reaction, which I think you guys and I are all in reaction to. Reactions to the reaction. We're all reacting to them. But that sort of that sort of some of those earlier visions of prosperity, there was nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with a family wanting to have a home and wanting to have, and there's nothing wrong with the suburbs. There's obviously physical limitations that you have to confront in terms of commutes and transportation, and that opens up a broader conversation. But I think that for sure the new left discourse was just kind of kick away the ladder, for newcomers, both in California and I think in developing countries. And then masking that behind a kind of moralizing around this particular lifestyle, which is not a vision that really includes much of anybody except for a pretty small aristocratic elite.
How did you see that occur in the Bay Area? I mean, no offense, but the Bay Area seems to be, along with the Puget Sound, sort of the epicenter of this kind of what I would call gentry liberalism, which is really fundamentally hostile to the middle and working class. Who pushed this? In whose interest is this? These movements don't take place because nobody supports them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, so, I mean, this gets to the housing issue, right? So, I mean, and kind of what do you want? I think where I've come down is that if these cities all grow in basically the same way, which is that you get some amount of extensification, some amount of densification, then that's the deal. I mean, that's the social contract. There's some agreement there. There's a lot across from my house in the Berkeley Hills. We bought a fixer up here, by the way, lucked into this crazy neighborhood. And someone's going to build a house on it. It's going to be a drag, like there's going to be all this construction there for a year or whatever. My neighbors are like, why are you going to try to stop it? And you're like, on what grounds other than just pure selfish assholeness would you try to stop that house? So, I think my neighborhood, there are empty lots in the Berkeley Hills. People do want to put duplexes and triplexes there. Why wouldn't they? It seems like if you think that there needs to be more people allowed in and there needs to be more housing in California, then you have to have some vision for growth. And then I do think you're probably not going to have like apartment buildings across from me right away. You probably might have a triplex or something like that. And then I think in all these, I go down to like El Cerrito and Richmond, and you're just on the strip there on San Pablo, and you're just kind of like, why are we defending? There's a bunch of just brown fields there that should have apartment buildings in my view. So I think, and then I'm kind of like, where do we want to put this additional suburbs if we've got farmland that is, between, Davis and the commute from here to Sacramento? It seems like, I think there's some questions around BART. BART was supposed to go to Marin. Why can't BART go to Marin? Why can't BART go farther down? So for me, I kind of go, I don't know, is there really that big of a difference between all of us in terms of a vision of growth? Because I think that's the choice. Once you go, there's got to be growth. If you go, there's no growth, then you just got to figure out how to pay for California to be like Hawaii. And it's a retirement community for people that lucked out and are wealthy. But if you're going to have growth, if you're going to be what California, I think, was, or what you guys and I appreciate about it, this dynamic, inviting, exciting, vibrant, growing, young state, and not just old farts like us, then I think you got to have some vision of housing growth.
Well, it would seem to me that we have some opportunities now with the COVID situation. Some people are saying that COVID is, a test, sort of a test run for what the environmental community would like to see, which is, basically mass unemployment and an end to any kind of growth outside of a few tech-related sectors. But is there some way that we can take out of this some advantages? For instance, there's going to be a massive amount of retail open. There's probably going to be a massive amount of office. So without having to go into anyone's neighborhood, you could build a huge amount of housing.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. Well, that one, does anybody even oppose that? That's just such a no-brainer for sure. Of course, I agree. We're in a retail space in Berkeley, my organization, Environmental Progress, just because for a variety of reasons, I wasn't even sure that we wanted to keep it. So during the coronavirus crisis, I just stopped paying rent. I told the landlord, I was like, if you need it back, let me know, because it's like the other stores are all boarded up, but it's like it should have an apartment on it. It's in Telegraph and Dwight. You guys know Berkeley. This is like this place where you're like, what are the NIMBY
2 blocks away
here? What's that?
The world is becoming just away.
Like the world is becoming like that beyond Berkeley too. We're seeing it almost doesn't matter what project you propose. There is going to be somebody who's going to stop it. They might use CEQA for that. They might use some other legal means, but everything is bollocksed up. There's no commonality of interest. And when I think about what you're talking about with kind of the future of nuclear, which I think is very exciting, the miniaturization of power plants. I mean, obviously not super miniature, but smaller scale. It's not like nuclear on the desktop quite yet. But I wonder what's going to happen when somebody says, we're going to put a pocket nuclear plant in the backyard here in this neighborhood. You're going to find some crazy people saying, forget about it, right? There's no way we're going to accept this. So how do we get the conversation going that is fact-based?
I mean, I think in California, the big event is the fact that there's just, we are just absolutely outside any moral norm when it comes to the treatment of severely mentally ill people who are on the street and have been basically behaving in a profoundly unethical way that violates basically every religious tradition, every moral tradition, the entire Enlightenment. There's no psychiatrist in the world that thinks the best way to treat people with schizophrenia is with methamphetamine and fentanyl, but that's what we are effectively doing. And this is a criticism of, I'm making a criticism of the left, but also of, I think, the libertarian right, the California Republicans, the libertarian, which is just sort of like, ACLU basically convinced the judges, and there's a bunch of rulings on it, that somehow doctors and family members can't get their schizophrenic family members off the street. So, there's CEQA laws should not apply to most of the things CEQA laws are applied to. I mean, I would be interested, and you'd have to waive it. I mean, I think this state is such a disaster, honestly, that I don't see any way to fix it other than to have a governor that basically does emergency regulations to basically solve the homeless crisis, which is really a mental illness and drug addiction crisis. Builds the housing that we need, just gets the housing going, gets through some legislation to centralize mental health care, gets through legislation to get some kind of housing resolution, which I would just call like a social contract on housing, like a new social contract, which is basically the contract between, people in the cities and in the apartments with the people in the suburbs. It's basically a contract that's just got to be 70% of the public has to basically agree with it. Like, you might do a citizens jury or something, but something where you just kind of basically where Joel and I can agree, which should be I'll represent the YIMBYs and Joel can represent the NIMBYs. And I kind of go, if Joel and I can sit down and write out a housing plan for California, then I do think that you would get a majority of people that are just like, yeah, look, we know, I think most Californians know we need more housing. There's a huge amount of confusion about it, and nobody's been proposing anything particularly visionary. Gavin just said, 3 million new homes and just waved his hands. And then he tried to sue Long Beach
Huntington Beach.
What's that?
Huntington
Beach. He sued Huntington Beach, and then it just kind of fizzled out. I interviewed all the housing out, all the YIMBY types, plus the Jennifer Hernandez types, and I was just like, why isn't Gavin doing it? And it's just, as far as I can tell, it's because a combination of ADHD and just no backbone. It's not even that he's a bad guy, I think he wants to solve these problems, but he's just too much a kind of creature or a tool, you would say, of the aristocrats, the Marin aristocrats and the San Francisco aristocrats who have ruled California for 50 years, 70 if you count if you count Edmund Brown, right? So I think we've got to smash that old system. I mean, it's time for political revolution in California, but it's not some left-wing revolution. I also don't think it's some Republican revolution. I think it is something that is basically moderate. I don't think that the Berkeley left that I know, who are all my friends in Berkeley, and the conservatives I've gotten to know, and the Republicans I've gotten to know, are necessarily as far as it may seem, but it's basically that you've had the left completely in supermajority control, which has meant the radical left has been in control, which has meant that the Greens who want to shut down Diablo Canyon, who shut down San Onofre, got to do that, even though I don't think there was really necessarily any majority will to do that. And I think it's what basically is what allows CEQA to just continue to be abused, right? It's those two groups. It's the Greens, just say NRDC, it's fine, it's NRDC, and Sierra Club, and the labor, or the carpenters, or the trade unions, right, is the other group that abuses it. I just think you got to have a strong executive. I think I think California has basically become almost ungovernable. It's chaos in the city. I spent 2 days on Skid Row, and I mean, you got to remember the United Nations came and like condemned California for just violating basic human rights. I mean, I came here in the 80s when I was 15, and I remember there being mentally ill people on the street and not understanding it, and my stepmom being like, well, Reagan, didn't fund the whatever, and learning a little bit about it. I'm going to tell that whole story in my new book, but it's gone on too long, and it has absolutely spiraled completely out of control, and it has to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, when I was a reporter for the Washington Post, one of my first stories was on the mental health issue, and what people tend to neglect. And if you read Jim Lorenz's book on the early years of the Brown administration, Brown was also part of this group that, get people out of the institutions and trying to.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me that what we have is we have a group of ideas or ideologies, whether it's on the homeless or housing. Like, for instance, I keep hearing everybody wants to live in a dense apartment. I said, well, there's not a survey in the world that will show you that that's what people prefer. I mean, there's a niche that wants that, and people at a stage of life, but not for most of their life. But what I think has happened, and it may be interesting given your recent experience with Forbes, that the media is a big part of this. And one of the reasons we can't find the common ground that I agree with you exist. I think you and I could sit down and say, this is what we should do, and we'd probably agree on 95% of it. The problem is the media doesn't allow it. You think about, we've had Jennifer as a guest, Jennifer Hernandez. Why is her lawsuit absolutely not being covered unless it's something that I write, or in some cases, people in the right-wing media? Why was your piece taken off Forbes?
Yeah.
So what's the role of the media in all this?
Well, yeah, I mean, boy, I had a reporter here interviewing me for some television show, asking me about it. She's a former CNN and CBS reporter, and she was describing things, because I never looked at this. I didn't care about this until it happened to me. I'll admit it. It was just barely, I was barely paying attention to it. I noticed Tom Cotton's op-ed. Of course I pay attention to that, but she was describing things, and I was like, that's terrifying, just the amount of control. Now, so it seems to me that the two things are happening at once. On the one hand, the mainstream media, the New York Times, is indistinguishable from the Guardian and the Nation. I mean, even the Guardian became like the Nation, and then the New York Times became like the Nation, right? So it's just a left-wing newspaper now, and that's kind of like more honest in some ways than arguably it was 10 or 20 years ago. But then it seems like there's these podcasts I'm doing, like with you guys and others, and what determines, or my own YouTube videos, or my TEDx talks, or my Forbes columns, is that and my Forbes columns, are like far more read than the New York Times reporters' articles on the environment. Like my piece on Amazon was probably read by 10 times more people than it's read by 2.5 million people, right? And they put that. That's what I like about Forbes. They let you see the number of people, so it's way more. So the Times can see that, and so they know, and you can kind of get this. I mean, I'm not bragging, I'm just saying I have 4 times more Twitter followers than like the New York Times climate reporters. And why is that? Well, it's because they don't tell the truth. They are like actively, in some cases, misrepresenting the truth, which is a nice way of saying the L word, or they're just dummies, or they're more often it's just they're ideologically driven to report badly. So that's game changing in the sense that we do have. So I think you have to look at them both happening at the same time. For me, I look at that and I go, mostly opportunity. I mean, the feeling of being censored is the worst feeling. I mean, it is really, truly. And it happened twice to me last week. It happened first with that Forbes article, then the Forbes article is reprinted everywhere, and then it gets onto Facebook, and Facebook censors it, claiming that there was false information in it.
Really?
And
by the way, did Forbes ever come back and say what aspect of their policy that your piece did not comply with?
Here's what I'll say about Forbes. They have suggested there was a reason that it came down that I do not agree with or believe is accurate, and I believe that my column was well within the contributor guidelines of Forbes. And I have enjoyed writing for Forbes and I'm going to continue writing for Forbes, and indeed tested that relationship after they censored my column, and I am indeed continuing to be a Forbes contributor. So I was censored a second time. It was actually more sinister. It was because my article was criticized by scientists, activists posing as scientists, who absolutely lie in misrepresenting the facts. I mean, the most outrageous and the one that's most obvious now is that there's no sixth grade extinction. Humans are just not causing a sixth grade extinction. You know, we're causing 0.001% of species. I'm sorry if I'm missing a zero. Don't quote me on that exactly. There's a lot of facts in my book. Percent species. You need 50% to have a great extinction. This is ridiculous. This is just pure, just unadulterated bullshit. Like, that's all that is. And that's why Facebook is censoring me, because I'm saying it's bullshit. So, okay. So that's the part of it. So when it's happening to you, when you're being censored, it feels horrible. You feel insulted because you have been insulted. You feel vulnerable because you're at risk of social death, which is fear of death. So it's the worst feeling in the world. Now, what I discovered is that it sure sells a lot of books. And that article went viral. And so I was kind of like, I guess I have to admit that it was good that they censored me, which is the weirdest thing, because it's
from a commercial perspective.
Yeah, it's called the Streisand effect. Apparently, I learned that on Twitter because they took photos of Barbara Streisand's house and she sued. And I guess as the lawsuit was going, everybody looked for Barbara Streisand's house. So, all right. So then that happened, and then this other thing, though. I'm in the middle of this fight with Facebook. And I can't even get a fucking response out of Facebook, and it's some fucking intern. God, I can't believe I'm dropping Z-bombs on your show. Sorry, guys. You can believe it out later.
Not regulated.
I'm pissed off about it. So anyway, so yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, I don't know. I mean, you kind of go, and by the way, it's Podesta behind the group, the Facebook group. I'm learning.
This is the former chief of staff of was it with Clinton or Obama?
Yeah, and he was her chair, and he's the inventor of the whole Russia Gate hoax. So,
well, I mean, the question is, what do we do against this sort of tide of censorship? I mean, I have to say, every time I write an article, like I wrote an article about how, about what Black Lives Matter actually believes. I just said, well, Jeff, before you give them, $10 billion, realize that they're fitting you for the guillotine. I mean, it's, this, and the fact that you can't even discuss almost anything that, that violates, the new canon. That's why in neo-feudalism, we make such a big point about the comparisons with the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Even a minor dissent on the nature of divinity would be a reason to get burnt at the stake.
Yeah.
And I
but
think,
this conversation,
too, right?
the conversation
the cultural revolution. Yeah.
Yeah.
The conversation that we're having is not a unique conversation. I'm hearing this all over the place, right? You have a group, the Children's Crusade, who is completely, numb to getting any input, and that's probably kind of the Facebook side of things. But rational human beings around the country are having this conversation, and they're not the right-wing Trump nuts, right? They're not the know-nothing party of Trump's. They're thinking people. What is this kind of the emergence of the new silent majority that's suddenly becoming not silent anymore? Are we having a rebirth of that?
Well, you guys saw the Harper article. You saw the Harper letter, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's I mean, somebody pointed out that a fair number of those people have been pretty terrible, demonizing their opponents in various ways, and I'm sure that's true. I mean, Chomsky's terrible.
Right.
Right about some things, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very dynamic moment. So it's sort of the predictions matter less than sort of our behavior. And, for me, I've definitely had to lean into my faith, which I actually came back to in writing Apocalypse Never, because I felt less embarrassed about it once I understood that everybody needs a faith. And after I got my faith back, then I was much more comfortable with questions of with kind of the, I think some of the fortitude that's required to stand up to bullies, because the truth is they are bullies, and the thing we know about bullies is that bullies are actually cowards, and that all that's often required is not much. In some cases it's amazing how little is required, but you actually have to firmly stand up to them. I think of it also like hecklers, because hecklers are bullies too, but that's obviously a different power dynamic. But it's the famous the guy that stood up to McCarthy, the journalist Murrow, right? What does he say? Decency. It's sort of a decency and civility question, and a kind of human rights issue almost. And so I think that calling it out for that, it was embarrassing. I mean, for me to be censored, it's such an insult and it's so embarrassing, but it was actually being like, well, this is not, I have nothing to be embarrassed about. I'm telling the fucking truth. And these guys are off on a religious crusade, out to persecute any heterodox, heretical thinkers. And we have to call them out on it. And I have to say, I'm very happy. When I wrote my piece saying Facebook has censored me. I say it's called, I have been censored by Facebook for telling the truth about climate change and extinctions. And it was like this huge piece. It was the most retweeted piece or whatever. So people are sympathetic to it. Look, I just kind of go, what is the deal with these social media companies? Are we actually asking them to regulate the First Amendment? Because if that's what's going on, then I kind of go, why is some private organization funded by John Podesta telling Facebook what's true on against the facts? That's not isn't that FCC's job? I don't even know what the policy environment here is. I think what's clear is that the cancel culture folks are a religious crusade that is one and the same with Black Lives Matter, the climate crusade. They're just the same people out on the street. And it's a radical project. It's a project of deciviliization. It's a project of, I listen to them go, defund the police, and I can just hear it. I hear it like, close the mental hospitals, close the nuclear plants. These are institutions that are kind of, make the universities stop teaching ethics, make the universities stop teaching history, make the universities stop teaching, anything other than the Maoist New Left, dogma. And so it's a decivilizing project. So it seems like we have to explicitly defend civilization and its institutions.
But clan warfare is really good for the social media business model.
But and I think that's where we're getting to the point that I think is what I find most amazing is the role the oligarchs are doing in pushing this. I'm enough of a historian to say this isn't going to turn out well for you in the long run, because the pressures are going to be on. Why should Jeff Bezos make $1 billion every day? Those questions are going to come up. So what I'm trying to understand is, what is the dynamic of the, if you will, the oligarchical ruling class to embrace what is essentially Maoist ideology? I understand in China that the oligarchs are members of the Communist Party, and it worked out okay for them. I don't know, but why does this happen? You've been around the environmental movement, which has long been supported by the very wealthy. Are they onto something that we don't understand?
Well, Mike Lind, he may have told you. You may have talked to Mike about it. Mike had this point. I guess it's okay for me to reference him. On the one hand, if I don't credit him, I feel like I'm stealing from him. But if I do credit him, then he's always like, "Well, don't tell anybody I told you that." It's like, okay, whatever. But he always goes, "It's just a kind of jobs grab," so it's just a kind of, you kind of go, Jeff Bezos is just going to hire a bunch of, people in HR and senior executive roles, and they'll do something. And it was the same thing in the Cultural Revolution. It was even, for them, it was even better. They got to kill their bosses, not just take their jobs and give them, early retirement. So you kind of go, that's what's happening at the Times. That's what's going to be happening at Amazon. That's going to happen at Google and Facebook and all these companies. I think part of it's moral panic. I think some of it's just due to Trump and Brexit and the fact that global order is clearly reverting to nationalism. And that is great uncertainty, especially for liberals who I think bought the myth of, that there's peace in the world because America's liberal values as opposed to America's nuclear shield, which is what it really is. And I think conservatives have been more comfortable going towards nationalism, and so they're a little bit less panicked at the collapse of the global order and even the violations of civility by Trump, which I think are viewed differently by progressives than by I think progressives view Trump's violations of civility as basically immoral, and conservatives just view them as violations of manners. And so so I think everything, when people talk about Trump derangement syndrome, TDS, which I think is a very good concept because I think it perfectly describes derangement as the kind of sense you get out of the left, that there's something, and I write about it very briefly at the end of Apocalypse Never, like a couple sentences, which is just that somebody's describing, when people are in an apocalyptic mindset, when they like literally believe that the world is coming to an end, if you're in a religious cult, for example, or this famous UFO cult, which was the basis for the cognitive dissonance research in the 50s, there's a sense, everything has meaning. It's a little bit like being on drugs or like hallucinogens or being schizophrenic, actually, where it's like every single thing is like laden with meaning. And so everything that Trump tweets and everything that, a hurricane and, oh my gosh, there's more flooding, and it's almost phobic, as opposed to kind of like, we are in a pandemic that is killing a lot of people, but it is this, you see with like the racism, it's like, so just one quick question. Do we think racism got worse exactly? And when exactly, and what's the mechanism for that? And what evidence is that? So it got worse since 2008 when we elected a black president? Or is it, or more racist since 1964? And people don't, and then they get mad at you. Well, you can't talk, you can't say that. You couldn't suggest that the country's less racist than it was. It's like, well, I kind of think I can, because I can see data showing that there's much more acceptance of mixed race couples.
Right, of course, yes.
In sports, black athletes are idolized. My son went to Berkeley High, and he said that like it was like the ways in which like the black kids were the coolest. It was like actually assumed that the black kids were the coolest. It's probably been that way, by the way, since '68. So you kind of go this and it's like, and so clearly, and the climate change stuff, where the disasters in particular, it's like no, it's got to be all the disasters. Like there's part of it that's a strategy, and there's another part of it that's kind of religious insanity. There's a part of it that I go that's religious, another part of it that I go that's almost a mental illness in the sense of being so phobic and so exaggerated in drawing this meaning. You had mothers with babies on their breasts in Trafalgar Square in London, all described in the book, with Extinction Rebellion holding up signs that said climate change is killing children. What's even the mechanism for that? Climate change means a change in average global temperature over time. Like that, it's not even like you actually have to, it's so indirect to suggest this. And meanwhile, deaths from natural disasters have gone down over 90%. No increase in costs. On every measure, everybody's better off. So it's clearly a religious panic. And I don't know that that's going to be solved in the way in the book I end with, a kind of, because I wrote this book in part for conservatives, right? I wrote it for liberals, but I wrote it for conservatives too. I end with Roger Scruton, who I know is a beloved conservative philosopher who passed away last year. I thought it was a nice way to end a book, which is a meditation on death and religion. And he kind of is like, wants to just kind of affirm rationality and law and institutions. And I was just like, that ain't going to do it. It's actually got to be grounded in love. And it's got to be grounded, as corny as that sounds, and this is, but conservatives are way ahead on this one too, got to be grounded in love of humankind, first and foremost, love of humankind, and then love of civilization, which has made us so much more humane and has made us so much less racist and less misogynist and less homophobic. I mean, that's why I spend the book so much of it is in Congo and Indonesia. And Indonesia, I talk with my translator about what does she think of gays? And she kind of evinces some homophobia, but is also more open. And so you sort of see this, and it's just like all of you wokies that work, you were the recent Wesleyan grads who went right from Wesleyan to the New York Times and think that they know how the world works. Come with me to the Congo and let's talk to folks about their attitudes towards gays. Or let's go to Uganda and see what people think about gays and trans folks. And then let's come back to the United States and see how you think it's going there. See which civilization you'd rather live in. And there's no sense of connection to the productive sectors of the economy, which is why it's so easy for people to think you could power it on renewables and organics. But I do think that the counter religion, the counter politics, it's counter politics, but since politics is religious now, you do have to embrace that mythic part, and it has to come from this Judeo-Christian tradition that affirms love of humanity, and this, because that's the only thing that can resist the hatred that we're getting from the radical left and this nihilistic, just tear it down. They go defund the police, and when the society goes, what the fuck? Defund the police? You think that African American communities want to defund the police? And then Black Lives Matter, they go, well, we didn't mean we meant, you just kind of go, there's got to be some big counter to it. And it does have to connect, I think, all these things together. That's where Apocalypse never basically ends, but that's what I want my next two books basically to affirm is that, because you do have to kind of go, and my next book is going to talk about this existential question from, Viktor Frankl in particular. Viktor Frankl's psychiatrist, where he would get depressed people who were maybe suicidal or even attempted it. And this is why he was a humanistic psychologist. And he'd be like, well, why don't you kill yourself? It was like the craziest psychiatrist, right? Why don't you kill yourself? And the person would be like, I can't believe you said that. Why don't I kill myself? And he's like, no, I'm curious. Why don't you kill yourself? And they go, well, I got my kids, and I'm married, and I would love to get that marriage back together again. And I feel like asking that question of the American people right now. Why don't you just split up? Just split this country up. What's that? That
idea of ad absurdum is a great suggestion because it forces you to deal with reality, right? The reaction to the absurdist outcome is, oh, okay, I guess now I really do need to look at reality. And that kind of is one of the themes of your treatise on the environment, which is that we've become so polar and so, absurd about the outcomes that we're not really looking at what the facts on the ground really are.
Well, and before we wrap up, I'd like to just ask you your prognosis. Let's assume that Trump loses in November, which I think is pretty likely, given the fact that there's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. He's not handled the pandemic particularly well. He didn't handle the Floyd situation particularly well. It's always funny to me that they worry about dictatorship, but there's never been a dictator who had no control of any major institution at all,
including his own.
Including his own,
right? Yeah, especially. Yeah.
So, what happens when Joe Biden becomes president? Are we going to see this green agenda being imposed, and will there be an opposition to it? What do you see happening, let's say, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration?
Chaos. The radical left is going to want, everything, and it's going to be terrible. And moderate Democrats are going to struggle with it. I think they're really damaged on nuclear. It's just become outrageous to everybody that Democrats, it's identical to the proposal we made 15 years ago, this Green New Deal. They even dropped the words Green New Deal, which, by the way, I haven't really written about it, but which betrays their own internal weakness on it, in the sense in which it's just a kind of, look, if unemployment is still high and you're still dealing with that, that wouldn't be where you'd put your recovery money. That wasn't a good use of it last time. It doesn't get you many jobs, and people like me will be out there saying, and others, and it's going to be hard for them to justify it. But I mean, if we are closing, I guess I would come back to it and just say, Trump, assuming that with you, I agree that he'll probably lose, and if he does, then really it's just the question of what do Republicans become, because that's like Democrats are just going to be, I think figuring out whether they're more like Biden or AOC, and all the energies with AOC. And meanwhile, Republicans are going to be free from all the baggage of Trump, but able to be a properly nationalist party, economic nationalist party that can focus on jobs. And so then the question is, what is it like? Why bother with America? I mean, why don't we just split up? Like, we'll just split. Nobody likes each other. It's easy to do. We'll just split the blue states from the red states, and people can migrate like they did after the Pakistani independence.
That's a very good role model.
Yeah, or just let why not? And I think if nobody can answer that question, then America's in serious trouble. Because if nobody can actually, and right now, as far as I can tell, I can't find anybody with a good answer to that question. And I'm not arguing. I'm not actually arguing. I'm not. I actually would think America. I love America. I think America has greatness in it. But I'm not sure I can sit here and tell you an answer to that story yet. But that seems to me like that's the big prey. Figuring out what that is the big prey, and because that's where it's all headed. And I just kind of go, the Democrats are going to become economic nationalists too. I just don't think global. I think global is like this whole global order. The global neoliberal order is just crashing around us. And so that's why I'm excited. I mean, that's why ultimately I am very optimistic. I kind of look at all the chaos and go, it might be that these parties actually reorient towards stuff that matters. And I think for the right, for the Republicans, that means getting away from this just kind of dumb libertarianism. This idea where, I would meet with Republicans after a while in DC, like a few years ago, and it would be like, it just didn't matter what the problem was. They had one hammer. Didn't matter what the problem was. It was always the same thing. What programs can we cut? What government programs can we cut? And I might be fine with cutting government programs. Actually, I think a lot of these programs probably are wasting money, but that's not actually how you solve a problem. Unless you just think like there's no problems that America has or that the government can solve, in which case, yeah, then you're just a party that just is a no party. And I think the Republicans, I don't think that's what they're going to choose. And I think that competition then for, and I see guys like you guys, and Mike Lind and certainly the Rich's book from the National Review, editor's book on nationalism. Rich Lowry's book.
Mm-hmm.
Yuval Levin's book. I see a lot of that ferment happening on the center right. I see some of it on the center left. But it seems to me like that's the big question: is like, what is America for? What is America about? And I don't think the answer is just freedom anymore. I just think freedom, in some ways, I'm with Jonathan Franzen in his beautiful novel on this, just such a brilliant novel in so many ways, which explores sort of the beauty and tragedy of freedom. Because freedom gets us 10,000 people, 10,000 severely mentally ill people on the street of San Francisco using heroin and meth. Because how could we possibly, involuntarily hospitalize them? Even though we hospitalize people with Alzheimer's all the time and take people with Alzheimer's back to their nursing homes every day, couldn't possibly do that with somebody with schizophrenia, even though 60% of them we know suffer from, lack of self-awareness. So, it seems to me there's, so I guess just to close, it would just be like, I don't know, I'm kind of less, I don't think we can predict what will happen under Biden, although I'll predict chaos. But it seems to me that the opportunity is increasingly clear, and that there's really, I feel like I'm feeling in a hurry almost. I'm excited to get to writing these books, because I go, all of the opportunities, the fact that it's not clear what's right or left, but it is clear that it's not neoliberal. It's not going to be dumb libertarianism. It's going to be something else, and it's going to be a new social contract where Americans understand what obligations we have to each other when it comes to the housing, to the economy, and to pandemics. You know, I open this book, the proposal that it opens this intro where I get Helen on Twitter, and she's reading through some of my pandemics. I was tweeting on the pandemic, and she's reading through some of the replies, and this woman goes, "Yeah, my sister is immune compromised, so I hope everybody stays home." And the guy responds, and he goes, "What? So I'm not supposed to go to work because of your sister?" And at the time, we were both like, "Oh, that's so insensitive," because, you know, we're like Berkeley liberals. But I thought about it, and I was kind of like, you know, he's asking actually a reasonable question, which is, what is our obligation to your sister? What is my obligation to your sister? It's one thing to just kind of go, oh, you know, you're your brother's keeper and whatever, but it's nothing to be like, what is the obligation? I don't think people have answers to that question. I don't think people know what their obligations are during a pandemic. And obviously conservatives and liberals have divided over that issue too. But clearly we need to come to some new ground where there can even be right and left disagreements on housing, but we're still in some sense that there's going to be some kind of a social contract.
And some sense of common values. Exactly.
Now, I think that's why your book is so important, and I'm very disappointed.
The book again is Apocalypse Never, why anti-environmentalism is a danger to us all. So did I get even closer with it, or?
That's so good.
Close enough, right?
Amazing.
Close enough.
I just need to call you and tell you something, and then have you repeat it back, because it's funnier the way you do it.
You know, it'll go through the big. It'll be go right through that sieve and just out the
awesome.
door. So, but no, it is. I'm reading it now. Okay, why environmental alarmism hurts us all. Close, right? Admittedly. But Mike, thank you so much, really, for taking.
Thank you. That was really great.
It's been a pleasure.
And good luck with the new projects.
Yeah, and thanks. Good luck with the next book, and we hope you'll be a guest again.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.